In this video, we're going to discuss the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, sometimes called the ADAS model or the general equilibrium model. After Keynes died, beginning in the 1950s, a number of economists worked to improve and formalize the system that Keynes developed in the general theory. This became known as the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This model is the major tool that we have to study macroeconomics. In the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, you have a number of aggregates. Aggregate demand, which is equal to the total demand for all goods and services in the economy. Aggregate supply is the total supply of all goods and services in the economy. And when aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal or imbalanced, we have what's called a general equilibrium, a macroeconomic equilibrium, or an equilibrium for the overall economy. Now, in the ADAS model, we describe problems like unemployment and inflation and business cycles as a situation where aggregate supply and aggregate demand are not in balance. They're not equal. And that's how we explain these economic phenomena. So we can look at long-run aggregate supply as the real GDP supplied when we're at potential GDP, when we're at full employment. And this is a vertical curve that represents the amount of real GDP supplied at full employment. This is the long-run aggregate supply. Now, we also have a short-run aggregate supply that looks more like a normal supply curve. It's an upward sloping supply curve. And this is the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level. So when the price level increases, the amount of short-run aggregate supply also increases. And when the price level decreases, the amount of short-run aggregate supply will decrease. Now, normally, the short-run aggregate supply curve will intersect the long-run aggregate supply curve at a certain price level. In this case, it's equal to 110 and point C. But if the price level falls, the amount of short-run aggregate supply decreases, and we're below potential GDP. These would be points A and B on the graph. Also, the price level can increase. We can be at points D and E. In these cases, the real GDP exceeds potential GDP. Now, aggregate supply can change if there's an influence on production plans that's other than the price level. So, for example, we might have a change in potential GDP because there was an increase in the number of hours that were worked, the number of labor hours. This is something that would increase the potential GDP if more people are working. Or potential GDP might increase if you had a greater amount of labor productivity. Maybe there was a technology that was invented or created that made all labor more productive. And in that case, you would have an increase in potential GDP. In those cases, since you have an increase in potential GDP, you also have an increase in the long-run aggregate supply. Well, it's also true that we can have changes to the money wage rate or other factors of production, and this will also affect the amount of aggregate supply we have in the economy. So the aggregate supply can change if something changes other than the price level. And so we can see that we can have an increase in potential GDP. This will happen if there's an increase in the full employment quantity of labor, if there's an increase in the quantity of capital that's invested in the economy, or if there's an increase in technology. And if that happens, both the long-run aggregate supply curve, the vertical curve, and the short-run aggregate supply curve, the upward sloping curve both shift to the right. They would shift from this point to this point. And in this case, we have the same price level, but a higher potential GDP. The real GDP, that's the potential GDP, is a higher amount in this case. And these three factors are the factors that we know will allow us to have economic growth. So it makes sense that the potential GDP would increase when we have economic growth. Now, it's also true that we can have a change to the money wage rate, and that will affect the short run aggregate supply. However, it won't affect the long run aggregate supply. So if the money wage rate rises, that's a fact. The money wage rate happens to be a factor of production. The amount of the short run aggregate supply will decrease. The curve will shift to the left from the blue curve to the magenta curve. And we have a new intersection with the long run aggregate supply curve. It's at the same point of real GDP, but it's at a higher price level. So now we can look at aggregate demand. The quantity of real GDP demanded is equal to the sum of all consumption spending and all investment and all government spending, and then the amount of net exports. So if we add all of those up together, we would get the quantity of real GDP demanded in the economy. So this is the amount that people plan to buy, to invest, for the government plans to consume, and that foreigners plan to buy in our economy. And that would be equal to the quantity of real GDP demanded, or the aggregate demand that exists in the economy. So the aggregate demand is a downward sloping curve. It's the relationship between the quantity of real GDP demanded, all of those things we just talked about, and the price level. And like a normal demand curve, it is downward sloping. The higher the price level, the less is the aggregate demand. The lower the price level, or the amount of price is overall, then the greater is the aggregate demand. So this downward sloping nature to the aggregate demand curve comes from the wealth effect and the substitution effect. So when there's a rise in price levels, that's the same thing as people having a lesser income. So they've got to rebalance the things that they demand, and so they'll demand less of everything because of the higher price levels is the same as a decrease in wealth, and so the demand curve would contract, would shift to the left. At the same time, there's two substitution effects going on. If price levels rise, then people may buy less today and save with the idea that they would need more for tomorrow, and that would also cause the demand curve to shift leftwards or decline. And when price levels rise in one country, imports may be cheaper, and so there may be more importing going on, and so people will demand less domestic goods relative to foreign goods. So all these effects, the wealth effects and the substitution effects, result in there being a downward sloping demand curve, where downward sloping aggregate demand curve. The higher the price level, the less is the aggregate demand. The lower the price level, the more is the aggregate demand. And so we can see from when we're looking at the AS model, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, it has a lot of the same characteristics that we see in microeconomics, with upward sloping supply curves, downward sloping demand curves, and some sort of balance or equilibrium where the supply equals demand. But we're not talking, in the case of this model, we're talking about the overall economy and aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So aggregate demand will depend upon a number of factors. It depends upon the price level, and we mentioned that when prices are lower, aggregate demand is higher, but it also depends upon a number of other factors: expectations about the future, fiscal and monetary policy that are conducted by the government, and then, of course, the world economy. And if one of those things changes, then we can have a change or shift in the entire demand curve, the entire aggregate demand curve. So people's expectations about their future income, about future inflation, and about future profits can change aggregate demand. So if we're expecting our income overall to be higher in the future, that means really everybody's incomes on average to be higher, well, then people will, the aggregate demand will increase today if people are expecting their incomes to go up overall in the future. In a similar way, if we're expecting inflation to happen in the future, then we're going to demand that's higher. We're expecting higher prices in the future, so we're going to demand more today, and so aggregate demand today will be greater. And then lastly, if we're expecting greater profits in the future for companies, well, firms are going to make more investments today with the expectation that they're going to have profits in the future to help pay for those investments. So they're not going to wait to get those profits. They're going to try to invest more today. So all of these factors, all of these expectations about the future can affect what aggregate demand is today, making it greater or less today based on future expectations. Now, fiscal policy also matters. Fiscal policy is when the government spends money to achieve macroeconomic objectives. And so they might spend money themselves on infrastructure and goods and services, or they might use tax policy or transfer payments as a way to put more money into the hands of the public and therefore allowing them to spend more. So a tax cut means people will get to keep more of their own money. They'll have it's like having an increase in income, and so aggregate demand would increase if there were a tax cut. This is also true for an increase in transfer payments. If you're going to have increase the amount of money that you're transferring from to certain citizens in the economy, or maybe all citizens in the economy, those transfer payments are the same as an increase in income, which will increase aggregate demand. And then, of course, an increase in government expenditures will also increase aggregate demand. Now, monetary policy is when the government attempts to use the quantity of money as a way of achieving macroeconomic objectives. So they might use interest rates or the amount of money that's in circulation as a way of trying to increase the buying power. So if there's more money in circulation, and then at least initially, there will be an increase in aggregate demand. And similarly, if interest rates are lower, businesses can borrow and make investments, and so that will translate into an increase in aggregate demand. So monetary policy can affect aggregate demand as well. And lastly, the world economy. If there's changes to exchange rates, that might make imports cheaper and or more expensive, in which case we may wind up exporting more, importing more, which affects aggregate demand. If the cost of if the exchange rate for the dollar goes down, then for people outside the United States, the prices of our products that are manufactured here will be less, and so they're going to want to buy more of those. And so, in that respect, if that's the case, then aggregate demand will go up. And the opposite is true when the dollar exchange rate for the dollar becomes stronger relative to other countries. So, depending upon what's happening in the world economy, there may be more or less demand for U.S. products, and that can increase the aggregate or decrease the aggregate demand that we see in the economy. So there's a number of ways that aggregate demand can increase, and if one of those factors increases, well, then what we're going to have is if aggregate demand increases, it moves out to the right, and if aggregate demand decreases, it shifts to the left. This is similar to an increase or decrease in regular demand for a specific market. So aggregate demand works the same way. Now, we have a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium when the quantity of real GDP demanded equals the quantity of real GDP supply. This is point C on the curve. It's at the equilibrium is when aggregate supply and aggregate demand are equal. At point C, we have a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Why is it a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium? Because we're talking about the short-run aggregate supply curve and not the long-run aggregate supply curve. And so, in the case of a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, if real GDP is below equilibrium GDP, well, firms will increase production and raise their prices. And if real GDP is above the equilibrium GDP, then firms will decrease production and lower their prices. And so in the short run equilibrium, real GDP can be either greater or less than potential GDP. In points A or B, you're going to be below potential GDP. The real GDP is going to be below potential GDP. And in points D and E, you're going to be above potential GDP. So when you're above potential GDP, firms need to cut production and prices to bring us back into equilibrium. And when we're below potential GDP, then firms need to increase their production and their prices to bring us back to equilibrium. Now, in the long run macroeconomic equilibrium is a little different. That's the case when the real GDP is equal to potential GDP. So the real GDP the equilibrium GDP at full employment is equal to the potential GDP. So the short run macroeconomic equilibrium, where the two sloping curves intersect each other, they intersect each other and are at equilibrium at potential GDP. So this is when the economy is also on its long-run aggregate supply curve. And the long-run equilibrium occurs at this intersection, point B. Now, there can be adjustments to the long-run equilibrium. So we might initially be below full employment equilibrium. And in that case, the money wage rate falls, and it keeps falling until the short-run aggregate supply curve passes through the long-run equilibrium point. So if the short-run aggregate supply curve were here, we would be below full employment. We would have higher prices and be below full employment. And when the money wage rate falls, the short-run aggregate supply curve will increase because the money wage rate is a factor of production for aggregate supply. So if wages are going down, then suppliers are able to hire more laborers and increase production, and they're also able to lower the price of their products because their cost of production is going down. And so we move from this point here, where we're below full employment, to the long-run equilibrium where we're at full employment. So we'll be back on the long-run aggregate supply curve, and the intersection, the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, where the two sloping curves intersect each other, happens to be at the same point where we're at the long-run aggregate supply. So a lot of things have to be in balance for us to be in macroeconomic equilibrium, and if we're out of that, we'll adjust. Here's an example where we're initially above full employment equilibrium. So the real GDP is above potential GDP. We're above full employment equilibrium. And so in this case, the money wage rate rises. The short-run aggregate supply curve starts to contract and keeps moving until it reaches the magenta line here. And we're back at the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium because the two sloping curves, the short-run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve, intersect each other at the point where we're at the potential GDP. The real GDP is equal to potential GDP. So this is where the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium is. And if we're out of that, if we're above full employment and above the potential GDP, well, the money wage rates are the adjustment mechanism, and the money wage rates rise, and they keep rising until we get back into the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And the two sloping curves intersect each other at the point of potential GDP. And so you can see in this system, Similar to Keynes, the system is based on Keynes's model. The money wage rates play a very important role in the adjustment mechanism. They're the rates that have to change in order for the system to be either in balance or tending towards macroeconomic equilibrium. And that's because Keynes defined the Keynes system was defined around employment and maximizing employment and being at full employment. So wage rates are critical to equilibrium in the ADAS model, just as they were critical to equilibrium in Keynes's model. So when we're trying to explain economic growth in this model, well, economic growth is when potential GDP increases, when we go from the light blue line to the pink line, that the real GDP is greater, and this is the long run aggregate supply curve moving out, and so potential GDP increases. And so how does this happen? Well, this happens if the quantity of labor grows, if there's an increase in the amount of capital that's accumulated and invested in the economy, and if technology advances in some way. If we have some sort of technological advancement that makes that improves really the cost structure for really all businesses, then we can have a greater potential GDP. And in this case, the long run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right, and that's a shift that results from one of these three things happening. And we know that these are the sources of economic growth: an increase in the amount of labor, an increase in the amount of capital and investment, and technological advances allow us to have economic growth. And economic growth in the ADAS model looks the vertical curve, the long run aggregate supply curve, shifts out to the right. Now we can also explain inflation in this model in monetary terms. So if the quantity of money that's in the system grows faster than potential GDP, well, then we're going to have inflation. So because when you have a higher quantity of money, that was going to increase aggregate demand, but it's going to increase it, and the aggregate demand curve is going to shift out to the right faster and more than the rightward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So this is a case where you have too much money in the system, and so when you increase the money in the system, you'll increase aggregate demand, and you see aggregate demand shifting out to the right. It'll also increase aggregate supply, but aggregate demand moves out faster and farther than the increase in aggregate supply. So you have more demand than supply at the aggregate level, and the result is inflation. Now we can also explain business cycles in the ADAS model. Business cycles result from fluctuations in either aggregate demand or aggregate supply. These things don't remain constant; they fluctuate around the equilibrium point, and these fluctuations are seen to be rather random, not really. In the ADAS model, we don't really worry about why the fluctuations happen. We just say, hey, there are fluctuations. Aggregate supply or aggregate demand can change, and the adjustment process with the money wage rate changing doesn't happen fast enough and rapidly enough to keep real GDP at potential GDP, to keep us at full employment. So so sometimes you can have an increase in aggregate demand that happens faster than the money wage rate can change, and then you're going to have an inflationary gap because real GDP is going to be above potential GDP, and the price level is going to rise. Now, in a similar way, we can have a situation where we're below full employment equilibrium. We can have a recessionary gap. This is when real GDP is less than potential GDP, and here, the economy will move. Will be at the wage rates can't rise fast enough to get us back into balance. And so when this happens, there's times when you're going to have a boom where real GDP is above potential GDP and you have inflationary gaps. Other times you'll be at full employment and you'll be balanced. And then sometimes you'll be with a recessionary gap where real GDP is below potential GDP. And so this is how the ADAS model explains and describes the business cycles, the boom-bust cycles. These are a result of fluctuations in aggregate demand or aggregate supply. And when you have that, you're going to be at a balance. The money wage rate is a thing that brings things back into balance, but the money wage rate may not change fast enough. And if it doesn't change fast enough, we have an inflationary boom or a recessionary gap. Now, when we have these fluctuations, you can have a fluctuation in aggregate demand, and in the ADAS model, these fluctuations are key to explaining lots of things that happen. So here we have a fluctuation. The aggregate demand increases, and so firms are going to increase both the production that they have, and price levels will rise in the short run because we're intersecting. This equilibrium represents a higher price level than the original equilibrium. And you can see here we're above, nothing's happened to the long run aggregate supply curve. Nothing's happened to potential GDP. So we have an equilibrium with a higher price level and a higher output that's above potential GDP. And this is what happens when you have an increase in aggregate demand. Now, you can have a similar situation, or what happens in this situation is in the short run, there's an inflationary gap. So the money wage rate begins to rise. The short run aggregate supply curve shifts leftward because with the money wage rate higher, the cost of production for suppliers is higher, and so they're able to supply less at each one of the price levels, and so supply decreases. When the cost of a factor of production increases, supply decreases, and that's what happens here. And the price level continues to rise until the real GDP, until we get back to the point where real GDP equals potential GDP. And this is what happens when this shows really what happens when we have the effect of a rise in the price of a factor of production. When that happens, the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left for the same reasons we just talked about. If the price of a factor of production increases, that's one of the things that causes supply to contract, for the supply curve to move to the left. And this is true in macroeconomics. We're talking about the supply curve for an individual product, but it's true in the ADAS model as well, where we're talking about supply overall. So the curve moves to the left, and real GDP decreases, and the price level increases. And so, this is one of the ways that we explained the period in the 1970s where we had both high inflation and recession. If you remember from Keynes, we're not supposed to really have those two together. We don't really worry about inflation until we're at full employment. And certainly when we're in a recession, we're not at full employment. So this was a bit of a conundrum for economists in the 1970s to explain why we had stagflation. Why do we have a combination of high inflation during a recessionary period? And the explanation was along these lines. Well, there was a major factor of production, oil, which was used for energy, and there was a shock to the price of oil based on the shortages of oil and the activities of the OPEC cartel to reduce the production of oil, which was really the way the shortage came about. And so what you had was a rapid increase in the price of oil. It's a major factor of production, really, that's used in everything in the economy. And so the supply curve shifted to the left. You had a lesser real GDP was less than potential GDP, and the price level was higher. So this is how we explained stagflation in the 1970s was due to an oil shock that created both a combination of inflation and recession. And so here we use the ADAS model to explain something that happened in the economy, and we use the ADAS model to explain a macroeconomic event that happened in the economy, this combination of inflation and recession that we called stagflation that happened in the late 1970s. Interestingly enough, one of the things that came out of the ADAS model was the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is a basic principle in macroeconomics that there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. That when inflation is high, unemployment is low, and when unemployment is low, then inflation will be higher. And so there's this curve here that shows the relationship between unemployment and inflation, and they're thought to be inverse. That when one goes down, the other goes up, and vice versa. And this is a main idea of the macroeconomic model. It comes, loosely from Keynes, but also comes from the ADAS model that was developed and formalized after Keynes. And in fact, the Fed chairwoman, Janet Yellen, who's in 2020 was named the Treasury Secretary, so she's held both those posts. But when she was the Fed chairwoman, she basically said that Phillips curve is a core component of every realistic macroeconomic model. This relationship between unemployment and inflation. That when you have high inflation, you have low unemployment, and when you have low unemployment, you have high inflation. So as late as 2007, Chairwoman Yellen, the chief economist, really for the Federal Reserve Bank, and the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, but also in many respects the chief economist, or the most prominent economist for the U.S. economy in the world, said, well, the Phillips curve is a core part of every realistic macroeconomic model that we have, and this is true to this day. It's fundamental, but interestingly enough, we see that it really doesn't hold up. Now, certainly in the case here, it didn't hold up. And this is one of the conundrums. There was supposed to be an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation, and yet we had both high inflation and high unemployment in the late 1970s, and it was explained by this supply shock with oil, but really it calls into question the veracity of the Phillips curve. And you can see here the article goes into detail about how the Phillips curve came about, and maybe that it's not certainly not a law in economics. It's not universally true. We see times when it's not true, and in fact, maybe it's not true that often. So this is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This is the major tool that economists use in macroeconomics to study macroeconomic phenomena.